And above all, I want to thank the gentleman who's sitting in the back by the door, Mr. James McLeod. The idea came up of having another promotional tour. I went through my cards on my desk, these pile of cards, and there's a golden card there with Genesis Health Service on it, and I emailed Mr. McLeod and I said, "What's up? Can you help me?" And that's why I'm here tonight. And that's why I was on Manatee TV a couple of days ago. But for me, the book, I think there is a need and a hunger for truth about what is happening in all our lives. And Florida is a very conspicuous case of how we've been told a bill of goods for a long time. People want to know about it. So I want to thank you, Mr. McLeod. I'm just deeply grateful to you. I know there are people who can, well, let me put this. I can't imagine ever living in a gated community. But I was on the radio up in Jacksonville a couple of weeks ago, and the verdict had just been handed down, and I remember the technology is such that I heard about the Trayvon Martin murder when I was in Bangkok just about a year ago, just before the book came out, and I felt this clench in my gut, and it was the combination of horror at what had happened and intellectual satisfaction of being proven right, that these historical patterns repeat themselves over and over again. Truly a mixed feeling. Well, I was in Jacksonville, again, it's about 2-3 weeks ago, and I was on public radio, and they're very kind to me there, as they are in many places, and they had a very strong, well-groomed, both intellectually and physically, woman, young, black professor from the University of North Florida. And she was absolutely polite. She was absolutely in control. And she was a model of what she should have been. And remember, this is National Public Radio. This is not your Tea Party station. And first we heard from the trailer park racist. And then we heard from a woman who was a gated community racist. She had an educated voice, like most of us have. Certainly I do. Got to get something out of a Harvard and Oxford education. And she said, "Well, why do they always play their music so loud? Can't the police do something about this? It's so loud." And finally it came my turn, and the hostess, the woman who's very kind, I'm grateful to be on her program, was, presenting my gilt-edged resume, Harvard, Oxford, all these magazines, New York Times, the New Yorker, Vanity Fair. I said, "That's enough for now. We have other business this morning." And I said, "Today is a day of shame for Jacksonville, for Florida, for the American justice system." I said, this is a crime that's been committed. And I said, I went on to explain, but I said, the Stand Your Ground law is simply the latest update of the black codes. And I said, the state of Florida has empowered grumpy old white men like me to go on a murder spree. And we do it in gas stations, we do it in gated communities, we do it. And I want to say something else as a white man, a privileged white man who lives in many countries, been entirely successful in his life, who has been the recipient, if not of enormous wealth, of practically everything else good that this culture can become. When I see 3 or 4 black youths walking down the street, playing their boomboxes loud, racism pervades us all. I feel stressed. I might cross the street, but that doesn't give me the right to take out a gun and blow their brains out. That's not right. So that's what I said, and what I try and do is, you get to a situation where how do you avoid having, on every Florida jury, an irreducible number of people who simply will not vote to convict a white man of killing a black boy. And I don't know, but I said what links all these people is they have no sense of context. And what I try and do in this book is show how we have arrived at this position. Now, I've spent a lot of time, and I've made many appearances, and all I want to tell you is that everything you think you know about Florida history is false. And I'll leave it at that, though I do have to talk about Ponce de Leon because it's the most obvious and clear-cut. He was not an old man. He did not discover Florida. As you will see from my book, Maps of Europe showed Florida years before he got here. But let us just suppose that he had come back to Spain with little vials, which he claimed contained the elixir of youth. What would have happened to him? He would have been handed over to the Inquisition for witchcraft. All this was made up by Washington Irving in the 19th century. The Spanish were here in Florida for nearly a quarter of a millennium. They never named anything after Ponce de Leon. That was all made up, I think in part out of some deep need to conceal the tragic nature of history. And I say, if you don't understand history, if you don't understand the world around you, then you will continue to build your lives on sinkholes. That's what I said in the New York Times last year when it was the supposed 500th anniversary, and I called it in the New York Times a fiesta of illusion. And of course, some people here in Florida get a tad exercised about that, but most people were glad to hear me tell the truth. Of course, writing for the Times is always so funny. I wrote "build our lives on sinkholes." They changed it to "build our houses on sinkholes." I changed it back to "build our houses on sinkholes." They changed it back. Finally I had my way. And so that's rare enough with the New York Times. But maybe today we can throw it open for discussion. But I'd first, I've talked about the bad people in history, and I don't want to remove these people from history. I just think we should keep the monuments and underneath tell them what they really did. And so some guy, and I was in signing books at a wonderful bookstore in Jacksonville Beach, actually Neptune Beach, and this guy was from Fernandina, which is of course a history-filled, history-soaked place. And he said, well, up at their gated community, they were thinking of building a statue to Senator Hugh Lee. Now here, this traitor to the United States rose in rebellion, was an apostate to his Jewish faith, got the legislature not only to elect him one of Florida's first senators, and then he rises in rebellion again. He also gets the Senate to declare that he is an Episcopalian prince from Morocco and changes his name from Levy to Uli. And I said to this guy, he's sitting there, well, I wonder what's going on. What goes through his mind? Here we are, and I want to build a statue to this guy in my gated community. It's just strange, isn't it? So I said to him, well, if that's not enough, oh, by the way, I read and write in Hindi and Nepali, so I can see what's up there. It says, what does it say? It says, it's a little far away in this light, but that says Anita in Hindi. I don't read Hebrew. Oh, it must mean peace or something, Chinese peace, and that's in Hindi. And of course, there are the other languages there. But that said, I said to the guy, I said, the other thing that's interesting about this guy, while he was away, not paying property taxes, rising in rebellion against the United States of America, he then comes back and his mansion has been transformed into an orphanage. And he kicks out the little orphans. And he gets the federal government to give him back his mansion. So I said to the guy, if you want to build a statue to a guy and he was deeply involved in the massacre at Allstead, which we can talk about later if you wish. But I say, if you want to build this statue to this man who culminated all this by turning poor little black orphans out into the street, I think you should do it, but at least put the information on the bottom and say what he did and maybe explain why you admire this guy so much. And I said, I would respectfully suggest why they were orphans. Why don't you build a statue to the several hundred black men who volunteered from Fernandina and fought for our country, not against our country? And meanwhile, I thought I would have to go on with this guy for a while, but the guy next to him was saying, you must be ridiculous. Why are you doing that? And I set off a little argument there, and it was very nice. There are there are many lies in Florida history. It's all lies, as a matter of fact, from the beginning to the end. But I want to talk today, as I started to say, about some of the great people of Florida history. The founding event of Florida was not this aged conquistador looking for Viagra. It was a massacre. And, well, I have to tell that story too. Good heavens, we might be here for a long time, but I'll start. And then when you're finished, you say, okay, we waited enough, we want to go home, and you can just say. So we're all taught, I always say, if you look at the Fountain of Youth, and you think that's the beginning of Florida, then the whole thing is like watching the weather report on local news. Oh my heavens, it's cold. Oh dear, it's hot. Oh, here comes a hurricane. There comes a frost. Is the microphone okay? Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And you would never know that the Earth tilted on its axis and it rotated and it went through the seasons, because they don't tell us why things happen and how things. Everything is sort of a little funny anecdote that means nothing. But if you start with what really happened in Florida and how it was founded, you have a coherent pattern. What happened is the Spanish decided Florida was absolutely worthless. They said its soil was too sandy, its lowlands too marshy, its harbors too shallow to permit a profitable settlement. And the King of Spain banned all further settlement here. That was before they found out the French had arrived and were in Jacksonville. So it was like the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. They tore across the Atlantic Ocean. The real founder of Florida, Menendez de Avilés, and coincidentally of St. Augustine, only because it was the most convenient place to leave his ships to kill the French. We're not massacred all the French. It was a scandal in Europe. Why isn't it in our American history books? I'll tell you why, because from day one, the truth of events here rebutted all the ideas of New World moral exceptionalism. Our history is a continuation of the blood feuds and the blood crimes of Europe and other parts of the world, and the genius and all that sort of stuff. You hear enough about that. I can praise people later if you feel you need a little anecdote to my rattlesnake bite or something like that. So anyway, I say it was this first massacre of white men by white men on territory later to comprise a part of the United States of America that begins the real history of Florida. And I might add, the real history of the United States. Now, at every stage, the other thing I do, I'm very careful with my words. I have over 50 pages of my notes, and I believe in using exact terms for what we're describing. So from the beginning, I described Andrew Jackson's activities as ethnic cleansing. We would use that term. It's a norm. For me, it's a neutral term. That's what he did, and that's how we did not buy Florida. It was bludgeon the Spanish into giving it up. All right, I keep threatening to tell some positive stories about Florida. At every stage, wonderful, heroic Floridians have risen up and struggled, sometimes as poor writers and academics, to stop us from being drowned in the fructose syrup of the history machine, which is as bad for you as that stuff in the supermarkets, you know. And sometimes they fought. And two of the earliest were a man named, remembered as Garzon or Garcia. He was a black man, and he was a subject of the Queen of Spain in Spanish Florida, free man. And a man known only as the Choctaw. He had come down along with hundreds of others, if not thousands, to flee Jackson's ethnic cleansing. And they had established peaceful communities upon the Apalachicola River. And Jackson ordered Gaines, who ordered a guy named Clinch to come down and kill them all. And that's what he did. And the two leaders were tortured to death. The women and children were, so white hands would not be dirty, were paid friendly Indians $50 a head to scalp them. And you know, I love these men, and I remember, and we're living in their Florida today, because in the beginning of the alliance of the black and the Choctaw, we see the beginning of the multiracial society we have here. The Seminoles learned a lesson from this. They never again concentrated their population. And another great Floridian, two great Floridians are Zephaniah and Anna Kingsley. And I remember the first time I told the story, I got a very stern email from the vice president of marketing at my publishers, which means the PR woman. She said, "Never discuss sex on NPR again." So we are not at NPR at this moment, so I will discuss sex. Anna was an African woman, a girl. She was he was a 40-year-old man, white man. He saw her, loved her, bought her in the Havana slave market, took her back to St. Augustine. He had her, that was a very important detail because he had her registered with the Spanish authorities so that later she could be emancipated along with their children. I say in the book, their love affair makes Aida seem suburban by comparison. Where are our Florida operas about these wonderful people, these wonderful forgotten people? You know what the historians are so good, they now say she's a Madagascar princess. And that she's of royal descent. Now what does this say to the hard-working women, not only black, Latina, white, who come down here, they're trying to find a job. They're saying, well, you know, you have to be royalty. Even if you're black, you have to be royal. And it's all nonsense, of course. Zephaniah Kingsley is very interesting. He was probably the most original and important American thinker after Jefferson and probably before Lincoln. He came about a generation before Marx, and he's sort of halfway between the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And he understood everything. He had a class analysis and a race analysis. This is like the 1820s. The Civil War is still nearly a generation away, but he already sees in this new country that race is tearing at us, that even more than slavery, it's the racist nature of slavery as practiced in the American South. And he had a very easy solution to this. And this was one of the reasons he called his article a treatise on behalf of slavery. Now for him, slavery was like indenturedness. It would end in a generation or two, you educated people. And he liked slavery, one of the reasons, because it afforded the most convenient opportunity for interracial sex. And he believed the way to solve our racial problem was for people to have sex with each other and produce mixed race offspring. And he wrote that when circumstances are favorable, the resultant, that is the children, were superior in form, intelligence, health, and grace. And you see, Zephaniah Kingsley was one of our predecessors as well, because all you have to do is go to South Beach or, you know, anywhere the trendy places, and you see all these marvelously gorgeous figures who don't fit into any of our old racist, racial, or ethnic stereotypes, to see how right Zephaniah Kingsley is. And he went into great detail, which I won't go into, which is how the production of a mixed race or a racially indifferent yeomanry would help stabilize society. He saw the problem was that Florida and the rest of the South was fatally divided among a tiny slave-owning oligarchy, the vast majority of white people, and then the black people and some mixed race people. And he saw the solution, which is for all of us to enjoy sexual intercourse with each other. And he said the practitioner of this noble enterprise should be admired for his, I mean, the quotes are where you go look it up. But what a guy he was. And like all great, everything ends. He wound up in New York, they went to Haiti, but what a great thinker he is. And he's never mentioned in Florida Works. If he's mentioned at all, he's treated as a joke. She's a princess and he's a joke, but there's another hero. All the Confederate battles were made up long after the Civil War. Go the next time you're anywhere, towns all the way down, even, I don't know about Fort Myers, but certainly as far south as Orlando. They all have their Confederate monuments. Go look at the dates. They're all, the one in Monticello where I was a week or so ago, classic North Florida 710. It was built in 1899, the year after the Spanish-American War, the great monument to Southern Confederate chivalry at Olustee was built in 1912. These are anachronistic inventions of nostalgia confected between the Spanish-American War and World War I. What really, if you want to find out what really went on, go read the Confederate archives. They don't tell that story at all. Olustee, which I won't, the problem is, of course, you speak to different audiences and you really have to repeat yourself. But I'm going to speak a little less about Olustee, which I visited a week or two ago. It's supposed to be the great Confederate white victory of the Civil War. However, that's not what General Beauregard told Jefferson Davis. He said, in his report to Davis, Beauregard said the results of the victory were insignificant. Why? Well, that was an interesting question. The other thing is what they never tell you. There was never any Yankee invasion of Florida. Most of the fighting here in Florida on the Union side was done by loyal white troops and colored regiments. And, you know, throughout the South and in Florida, 15 to 20% of all the white people, whatever they thought of black people, whatever they thought of slavery, they were loyal to the Union. And they stayed loyal, and this is where the troops came from. But in this particular case, these troops had come from South Carolina, from Union troops from South Carolina. And as they advanced, they were attacked, ambushed by Confederate troops. They were never trying to get to Tallahassee or anything like that. It was just an exploratory mission. And they fought and they were withdrawing, as they always did, from Central Florida. They had strict instructions not to waste time, men, and money occupying the interior of Florida, which they considered worthless, as did the Confederacy, but we'll get that to in a minute. And so the black troops came in and covered the white retreat, withdrawal. And so the question is, why then did the Confederates, this rare, indeed unique opportunity, when for once the Confederates had some advantage, why didn't they pursue it? Well, a staff officer wanted to know. He went down to a field officer and said, what's the reason? What are you doing down here? And he said, killing niggers, sir. This great victory was one of the worst race massacres of the war. And the bodies to this day of more than 500 loyal American troops, most of them black, but many of them white, have never been respectfully gathered together and buried. Now, you know we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in Indochina searching for the remains of Americans who were lost there. We haven't spent a penny to find the loyal Union dead. And this, again, is where history interconnects. A fellow went back who'd been at the battle, and he said the pigs had disinterred all the bodies, and he found skulls and spinal columns all over the place. And this is where the myth of the Southern chivalry intersects with the myth of the gallant conquistador. Because Desoto went mad when he was in Florida. He never discovered the Mississippi River. He may have seen it, but he lost his mind. I don't know how we'd define it today, but he clearly would have been treated as a case of psychosis, nervous breakdown. And as the most reliant, if you want to find out, the Desoto Trail was made up in 1939 by a congressional committee, all those places. And his earliest biographer, a man called the Inca, about whom I could write an entire book, said, we will never know where he went because DeSoto cared only to search for gold and silver, and hence they made no note or carried no instruments to know where they were. And at the end, when he was buried, all he had left were his pigs. I call him the Johnny Appleseed of pigs. And it was these pigs that still forage around Florida that have rooted up these American bodies at Olustee. And the legislature has not sent a penny to do that. I did have an article in the Daily Beast. You can just do Allman Lecture, and you can hear much more about that. Another of the fake battles, and again I'm talking about my heroes in Florida, was Natural Bridge. That was all made up. There were no cadets there, none of them, everything about it, just fabrication. What really was going on, they had no interest in getting to Tallahassee. What they thought they did, they came up the St. Lawrence River, and they thought that some Union prisoners were in Thomasville, Georgia, just north of the border, and they wanted to rescue them, and this very important mission was entrusted to, again, to these black regiments. And unfortunately, these poor fellows had been transferred to Andersonville several months before, so they got there and it was a fool's errand. And there comes a moment in every book when I know I'm going to make it. And it usually happens late at night when I've finished writing something and I look back and I start sobbing with compassion for the people I have just described in their life. And in this case, it's a black Union soldier and a white Union soldier. And the naval officer who ferried them up the river in this valiant, doomed attempt to save Union prisoners in Georgia. One was black, and he paid the black man the best compliment he knew how, considering his context. He said he looked almost like a white man, as handsome as a white man, except for his black skin, of course. And he called the white man a cracker of the better sort. And again, you see, I call them the first responders. These are the guys we begin to see at Negro Fort. And they emerge later, and today they could be a law firm, they could be big drug lords, they could have a construction company. And, you know, as I say, you don't care what the color is when your house is on fire with the first responders. Another image that has emerged as I've talked to different groups, I never plan what I'm going to say in advance, concerns Stand Your Ground. And, you know, I call Florida the truth teller state. I also call it the Play-Doh state. You know, we see all these interesting vanity plates. Maybe we can get them up in Tallahassee to create Play-Doh plates and truth teller states. Well, the truth teller, Florida is telling us the truth all the time. The problem is the truths which Florida tells all the time are so deep and so important that a lot of people don't want to know those truths. Let's take an example of the 2000 presidential election in Florida. What did that tell us? What truth did that tell us? It told us that our electoral college presidential system, which began a legacy of pandering to slave owners, giving them more power even than they were entitled to on a one-man, one-vote basis, is a standing threat to our democracy. That's what Florida told us in 2000. And you know, what is Florida every day? Go in your backyard. Florida tells us climate change is here. Florida tells us you cannot put nearly the population of Australia on a relatively small limestone peninsula and adjacent territories which has no natural resources, not even water, because water has to flow up and down, and not expect climate change to have an enormous impact. Again, you know, maybe if we took the trouble to understand things, we would not build our lives on top of sinkholes. I have to believe that. That's why I write those books. So I think of these splendid men, and the account said, neither the colored soldier nor the cracker returned that day. He assumed the black man had been killed by gunfire, and that the white man had been shot as a deserter. Now, but deserter is what the Confederates made. Not that they had deserted from the Confederate Army, but by the very fact of being a loyal American citizen, they were deserters. Well, there are many other Floridians whom I admire. I want to talk about Ossian Hart. In our school books, maybe he's still described as a scalawag. And what he was a brave, honorable, he was the first Florida-born man ever elected governor of this state. And he sided with the Union. And he was from Jacksonville. And he integrated the schools. He made common cause with the cattle ranchers down here in southern and southwest Florida. And he passed legislation of the kind that would not be seen again in Florida, or indeed in the United States, for another 90 or 100 years. And one of the most pernicious myths of Florida is that it never gets cold here. Cold killed the Challenger astronauts. Everybody was so convinced it never got cold in Florida, they didn't construct the O-rings so that they regained their elasticity following cold weather. Now remember, the Russians send people into space and come back, and their O-rings, they know if they land in Kazakhstan, it's going to be cold, and they manufactured their O-rings to deal with that. The O-rings are nothing but the equivalent of that little washer in your garden hose. So that's the cold. Two of the 10 greatest natural disasters of the 20th century were frost. Usually I have a great interlocutor interview, he gets me back on track, and I'm sure. So let me just go on to citrus. Citrus doesn't belong here. It comes from China. You know, when the guy started the great company, he didn't call it Subtropicana. He called it Tropicana. But we live a subtropical climate here in Florida, as you know. And what I find so interesting about the current crisis of the citrus industry is you have this plant that came from China and was planted here and introduced, and they keep moving south and south and south, because it really was a tropical plant originally. But the virus that's killing it, the name, it's got green in it, it's a direct translation from the Chinese. And you see, it started in China, and it's pursued the citrus around the world, and they're doing battle here in Florida. And that's what always happens in Florida. People come, we get to the Play-Doh state. People get here, they project their fantasies upon it. They mold it to their fantasies, and then they watch as Florida oozes back. I mean, Florida always wins. You can't beat a swamp, you know that. And, you know, it's so interesting to see all this happen. The human diversity is much greater. But, you know, I think in the end, for today, for this afternoon, let's stick with the sinkhole metaphor. You know, the knowledge is there, the understanding is there, and we can blame the press and the politicians and the cable networks, and certainly all of those people are horribly and culpably derelict in their obligation to understand the truth and report it honestly. That goes without saying. But in the end, nobody can sell you a house on top of a sinkhole unless you're willing to be sold. And I think I see a crowd here, of course, is of thinking people, of knowing people. I think many of you, or some of you, I enjoyed being on your radio station. And I really want to thank you for this adventure of coming here.